Well, we will go ahead and start, and I am sure that we're going to have a few more stragglers, but I think that'll be okay. We are so glad that you all were able to come to our third Jack Hadley Black History Museum speaker series talk, especially for Black History Month. This is the third in a series of these talks, and tonight we have a real treat for you. Piotr Derengowski is an assistant professor of history at the University of Gdansk in Poland, one of the leading scholars outside of the United States studying the American Civil War, maintaining a long tradition that started, I guess, probably most famously with Karl Marx and on forward of European scholars who are interested in and really learning from and learning about and teaching us about our own Civil War. And I should say that though Poland is far from Southwest Georgia, he has a connection to the region. He spent a semester with us at Valdosta State on a Louis Brown Visiting International Scholars Fellowship. He is an excellent scholar and storyteller, and I'm sure you will love hearing from him. Tonight, he'll be talking to us about the brief history of the U.S. colored troops during the Civil War. Please welcome Dr. Piotr Derengowski.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. Okay, so I will share my screen so you will be able to see my presentation as well. Okay, so I have to say that, I've been interested to the Civil War, like since, wow, it's almost, I believe I'm doing a research on Civil War for almost 20 years. So it is a pretty long time. But just recently, I have to admit that my focus from the Civil War is, somewhere around African Americans and their participation. And this is, really something that is almost unknown in Poland. But I believe there are also still some things that are not known about the participation of African Americans in the Civil War in the United States as well. And today I will tell you this brief history of US colored troops during that war. And in fact, we have to make a really huge seizure, okay? This is like 1863 and obviously the Emancipation Proclamation. And before that Emancipation Proclamation was issued, we see that there is a totally different policy toward participation of African Americans in the Civil War, and after it is obviously a huge difference. But what is interesting, and what probably not many of you might know, is that free blacks, okay, offered their service to both governments, so to the Union government, but also to the Confederate government already in 1861. Okay, but interestingly enough, on both sides, they were rejected. Okay, obviously for different reasons, but both in the North and in the South, those free blacks were not allowed to serve. According to the federal law from 1792, okay, it was forbidden also for blacks to serve in the U.S. Army, and that was one of the arguments that the federal government actually, presented while they rejected the service of blacks. In the South, obviously, they were not willing to accept service of blacks because they wanted this war to be, not about this issue of slavery. They wanted to present it as a war of independence. Obviously, with the cornerstone speech of Vice President Stevens, it was no longer possible to avoid the topic of slavery. But nevertheless, since then, we are seeing different attempts, okay, especially in the North, to arm blacks, okay, But these initiatives, whenever it was possible, they were undone by the federal government. Only when it was impossible to undo what those generals did, then the Congress was passing some legislative steps, to actually, confirm those changes. And in such way, in May 1861, we are seeing that Benjamin Butler is actually accepting those fugitive slaves and using them to physical works around Fortress Monroe in Virginia. And he, we might say, coined the term of war contraband. Okay, he said that he will keep those fugitive slaves as war contraband. And actually, Lincoln decided to sustain Butler's decision. And as a result, we are seeing that the first Confiscation Act was passed. And according to this legislation, the government was authorized to seize whole property, including slaves, used by the Confederacy to work or service against government and legal authorities in the United States. And it is estimated that during the war, close to 200,000 contraband worked within the Union lines. And then we are also having other rank and file initiatives that were deemed quite dangerous for the federal government, because in August 1861, General John C. Fremont, he issued a proclamation of emancipation in Missouri. And he declared free all the slaves of disloyal owners in Missouri. But obviously, President Lincoln was trying to keep those border states within the Union. So he was not willing to anger those slave owners that might decide to support the Union. So he actually asked Fremont to withdraw this proclamation, and Fremont was not willing to do that without the official order. But such order came, and Lincoln, forced Fremont to repeal this proclamation as, to quote, illegal usurpation of governmental authority. Obviously, non-officially, because the government was afraid that such decision would push Kentucky and Missouri into the arms of Confederacy. And then at the end of the first year of war, we are seeing in the decision, in the annual report of Simon Cameron, who was at that time the Secretary of War, he said that it is clearly a right of the government to arm slaves when it may become necessary, as it is to take gunpowder from the enemy. And obviously, Lincoln did not like this phrase well, and he forced Cameron to remove it. And with the beginning of 1862, Cameron was no longer a Secretary of War. But then we are seeing that during the next year, there are far more important changes that appeared, because we are seeing an emancipation of slaves in federal territories, and two very important pieces of legislation that were accepted. First of them was the Second Confiscation Act. According to it, federal court could free slaves used to work against legal government and those belonging to persons engaged in the rebellion. So this is the extension of the first Confiscation Act. Now, slaves did not have to work against the legal government. It was enough that they belonged to a person who was fighting against a legal government. And far more important in terms of service of African Americans in the Army was the Militia Act. Because according to this act, President of the United States was authorized to receive into the service of the United States for the purpose of constructing entrenchments or performing camp service or any other labor or any military or naval service for which they may be found competent persons of African descent. The problem with that act was that already from the very beginning, it started a discrimination toward Black volunteers, because the pay that was offered to them was $10 per month, from which $3 were deducted for clothing. And it might seem that $10 was still pretty, that was a lot. But if you compare that with the pay of a white soldier, they were receiving, a white private at that time was receiving $13 plus $3 additional for clothing. So in reality, a Black volunteer was receiving $7, while white volunteer was receiving $16. So this is a pretty big difference. And in the same year, we are seeing first attempts to form Black troops, at first without the authority of a Department of War, and then with such authority. Among those who were organizing those Black troops without the authority, we should mention three generals. David Hunter, who is doing that in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. But actually, this is not I would say, the best example, okay, because he was actually forcing those Blacks, okay? He was not giving them an option. So it's hard to say that those Blacks who served in his troops were volunteers, okay? Because basically he was forcing them to join his troops. Then we are seeing also John Phelps, who was trying to organize a unit composed of Blacks in Louisiana, but he failed to do so. And then also it is worth to mention James Lane. He actually recruited a regiment in Kansas, and it was composed mostly of those runaway slaves from Missouri. And his unit was the first African-American regiment to see combat during the Civil War. And that happened in the skirmish at Island Mound in Bates County in Missouri in October 1862. And finally, in the mid-year, so we might say, summer and the fall of 1862, we are seeing first attempts to form Black troops with the authorization of the Department of War. And such attempt was undertaken by General Rufus Saxton, who was authorized to recruit 5,000 African Americans, and the first unit he raised was called the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, and this is the first regiment composed of former slaves from the South. Okay, and then General Benjamin Butler, he also accepted into the service regiment of Louisiana Native Guard. And interestingly, this is the very same regiment that offered its services to the Confederate government in 1861 and was serving as a kind of a state unit in Louisiana till Union invasion in April 1862. And we have to admit that Butler, since then, he is becoming kind of a champion for organizing Black troops, because he's one of really few Union officers, high-ranking officers, who refuse to recognize Black soldiers only as uniformed ditch diggers. Okay, he really believed that they can achieve something, that they are worthy to wear the Union uniform, and they should be treated equally with other Union soldiers. And at the end of the war, he in his Army of the James, there will be serving the 25th Corps, which was the first and the only corps in the US history entirely composed of Black units. But the thing is that all those attempts, without the support of the commander-in-chief, so President Lincoln was, that was nothing. And Lincoln, till very late in 1862, was not willing to use, to see the enlistment of blacks, okay? There's this famous letter that he was writing to Horace Greeley. Horace Greeley was the editor of the New York Tribune. That was one of the most, I would say, radical newspapers in New York, probably. And he was very openly saying what was the purpose, what was the aim of the war. And he said, my paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. And it's not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. And this is basically what he did. Okay, the Emancipation Proclamation, even though in general opinion it freed all slaves, it's not true. It only freed slaves that were under control of Confederacy. So in reality, not even a single slave was freed as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay, those slaves that could be freed, that were under control of the Union, they remain in slavery. What's more, those who were running away from the territory controlled by the Union on January 1st, 1863, they were returned to their owners by the Union authorities. So the question is, what finally convinced Lincoln to arm African Americans? We have to remember that, the Union actually was losing plenty of soldiers, so there was a huge necessity to replenish those incomplete units. Okay, there was the necessity to find an occupation to those 500 to 700,000 fugitive slaves. And finally, there was a necessity to deprive Confederacy of its working force. So finally, in 1863, we see this great change. Okay, it all started with January 1st, 1863, and the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. Then we are having another landmark piece of legislation, and this is the Enrollment Act. And, till very recently, I was thinking that Enrollment Act that actually forced draft was not in any way related to the service of African Americans, because it was talking about service of citizens or those who were willing to be citizens. And obviously, because of the Supreme Court ruling in case of Dred Scott, it was believed that African Americans cannot be citizens of the United States. But apparently, in those states from the North that they could vote, like Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, they will also, under this Enrollment Act, okay, perceived as potential draftees. Okay, when I was checking those court-martial cases, I actually found out that some of them were having problems for not, coming to the unit on time. Nevertheless, we are seeing that after the Emancipation Proclamation, first units were organized. Okay, Edwin Stanton authorized governors of those states from the north, so Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, to raise regiments composed of free blacks. I believe one of the most famous ones from Massachusetts is the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. There's a wonderful Hollywood movie about it, Glory. I love to show it to my students, but there is also a Polish accent in the 54th. The assistant surgeon was Pole in the 54th, Louis Radziński. So there is also a small Polish accent in that unit as well. And what's more, we are seeing that in almost no time, okay, the authorities decided that they need to centralize the process of recruitment of African Americans, and they decided to found the Bureau for Colored Troops in the Adjutant's General Office. And main task of this bureau was to supervise over recruitment, to examine the candidates for officers, and as a result, majority of Black units were assembled into one organization, U.S. Colored Troops. And this is a huge moment because this is a clear message for those African-American volunteers, okay, that they were not fighting for particular states, but they are fighting for the United States of America and the government that promised them freedom. Okay, this is what Douglas was saying, okay, that they have to fight, they have to prove themselves. And this is the way to win for them all those privileges that they deserve. And there are obviously some notable actions of U.S. Colored Troops, none of them, unfortunately, successful. The second battle of Fort Wagner, this is the battle that is presented in the movie Glory, okay, with heavy casualties, but still they prove that they are really good soldiers. Then the Battle of Crater, this is one of the saddest battles in the history of U.S. Colored Troops and in the history of the Union Army, as General Grant said. Totally not prepared, really badly commanded, and those Black troops, but also white troops that were fighting in that battle, they actually were suffering heavy casualties. And then finally, one of the finest battles in the history of U.S. Colored Troops, the Battle of New Market Heights. Plenty of Medal of Honors for it. Okay, so just to summarize, we are seeing during the war really noble watchwords, okay, about fighting for freedom, joining the war, okay, but in reality, those Black soldiers that were willing to sacrifice their lives, okay, not only for their freedom, but for their country. Okay, they were discriminated on many occasions. They had worse armaments, insufficient drill. On many occasions, those troops were only used to manual labor instead of, they were not treated as first line combat units. Okay, they had worse armament. They had lower pay for most of the war. Okay, equal pay for those who had been free before the war was introduced only in June 1864. Okay, and for all Black soldiers, it was introduced on March 8th, 1865. So this is basically the end of the war. Okay, there's insufficient medical care, and this is probably the biggest difference, because it is estimated that 1 out of 5 Black soldiers died because of diseases. Okay, in white units, this ratio was 1 out of 14. Okay, so and during the war, out of altogether 180,000 Black soldiers, 40,000 Black soldiers died, and only 2,900 in combat, all remaining because of diseases and insufficient medical care. Obviously, and this is, I would say, the brightest part of their story is that, those 25 African-American soldiers were among the recipients of Medal of Honor. 7 sailors, 15 of them from U.S. Colored Troops, 3 from other units in the army, and 13 of them received those Medal of Honors for the Battle of New Market Heights. Okay, so from my part, that'll be it. Thank you.
That was excellent. That was excellent. Very interesting stuff, and we have lots of great questions for you now. I put some of them in the chat from myself just so that I wouldn't forget that I wanted to ask them. But our first question comes from Eugene Wilson, and it says, even though they were of different races, were the South Carolina Black volunteer soldiers trained on the same tactics as the white soldiers?
You know, there was a special I'm looking for a right word, you know, because there was an easier way to teach Black volunteers tactics, because they thought that they need a special drill. Okay, in many cases they thought that Black troops will be better as a light infantry. Okay, so they prepared, I would say, this a special book for them. Okay, from which they were training them. So they were prepared in a bit different way. I don't know if we might say better or worse, but you know, in many cases they were feeling that, you know, this is the best way to prepare them to fight. And I think in this case, you know, they were really trying to prepare them well. That was the whole purpose. So I believe I don't remember right now the name of this officer, but he prepared the entire code for them. Okay, to prepare them to battle.
Excellent. You mentioned that there was a poll in the 54th. What did the Polish participants think about Black troops? I mean, I'm sure even as immigrants, they're identifying as white. Are they adopting white attitudes, or are they more egalitarian than Americans?
Now, you know, I would say Polish immigrants were adopting the views of the people that they were living among. Okay, so we are seeing actually white abolitionists. There are famous two female abolitionists that were, you know, quite active during the Civil War. One of them actually even opened the hospital with the School for Nurses in Boston in 1862, Maria Zakrzewska. But there were also those, I would say, quite racist, okay, attitudes toward Blacks, even. And surprisingly and sadly, even among those who decided to join the U.S. colored troops. So we see there is a diary of a Polish officer who was a commander. At first, he was a captain in 27th U.S. Colored Troops Regiment, and then he was a commander briefly of 118th Regiment. And unfortunately, this diary is not a pleasant lecture. You know, you see that, and so wow, if you think in such way about your soldiers, you should not be there.
Right. And I'm sure that's only a diet version of what the American white officers are thinking in their heads.
Yes, he is complaining, and he's constantly complaining about, you know, on white Americans officers. So, you know, he is complaining all the time, but it's still with them. Okay, he's sharing all the experiences. He's fighting with them. Okay, he's not hiding. That's for sure. But you know, it is obvious that his soldiers deserve better treatment. Okay,
right. You know, you talked about Lincoln's hesitancy on a lot of these issues, especially around contraband and things like that. And Lincoln has taken an historiographical turn over the last decade or so as we've kind of reinterpreted him and kind of decided that he's not the great emancipator that we once thought he was. What does the use or the lack of use by of Black troops by Lincoln tell us about his thinking about racial equality? Where do you find him on that line?
You know, for me, Lincoln as a president is still the Lincoln from Lincoln-Douglas debates. He's the Lincoln that many Americans actually trying to avoid, okay? And it's not the superhero, okay? What made the Lincoln hero was an assassination.
Right.
If he would live till the end of his second term, there would be nothing like radical reconstruction. Okay, he was very lenient, and he was planning to be very lenient on the South after the Civil War. So, you know, assassinating him was actually not the best move from the view of the former Confederates. Okay, like, you know, and so that's it. But you know, for me, Lincoln was always, I would not say that he was racist, but he was full of those racial prejudices, okay, of his time. And it's hard to, you know, he is representing what I'm calling the aversive racism, okay? So we, as almost entire North, they had no problem with African Americans as long as there were no African Americans in the North.
Right.
So this is what I would say, yeah.
I think that's right. I always tell the students that, you know, while there was slavery in the South, Ohio and all these other states had laws that made it illegal for Black people to move there. I mean, they were against slavery, but they were also against Black residency of any kind. And Lincoln certainly comes from that mold. It's interesting. I think part of the story is about these Black soldiers being acted upon, but most of it is about them being the actors themselves. You know, in the Revolutionary War, we see Black soldiers fighting on both sides, with the Americans and with the British. And the general historical idea here is that they weren't fighting for a country, they were fighting for whoever was going to be best for Black America. That whatever side they interpreted as being the possible grantor of freedom was the side they were going to fight on. And it really didn't matter which side that it was, which makes me wonder what is motivating. So there, in other words, there was a motivating factor, whether Black troops fought for the Americans or the British in the 1700s. What is the motivator for Black volunteers to sign up with the Confederacy? I mean, what in the world is motivating them to want to do that?
You know, I believe that, you know, this is still for me kind of a puzzle, but on the other hand, you know, it's not an easy, the racial issues in the South, they are very complex, okay? And when you realize that some Blacks owned slaves before the Civil War,
it's true.
Then you see, you know, those from the top, and we have to say that those free Blacks in Louisiana were kind of at the top, okay, of their possibilities, and they still wanted to go one level up, okay. And I believe that by siding with Confederacy and showing that they also wanted to fight for the South, okay, or rather for Louisiana, I would say, they thought that they maybe will, you know, receive some more rights there, that they could be treated equally with whites. I don't know. That's my guess, because we do not see any kind of I don't know at least any kind of sources from their side, okay, why they decided. But I believe that's something like that. But in almost no time, 1 year later, they are siding with the union. So
Right. I think it might again be that kind of Revolutionary War era assumption that we're just going to do whatever is best for us. We don't really care about which the sides are. And I think Louisiana is interesting because Louisiana is the only one of the Deep South states that has a large free Black population, that has a viable Black middle class before the Civil War. That's going to make them want to protect that, I guess. I think maybe you're right.
I believe so, and see that in the same way as later on with Plessy versus Ferguson. Okay, not all of them looked like blacks. They in many ways they were really white. Okay, so that's why for many Confederates also it was acceptable to see that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there was so much miscegenation, especially in Louisiana with Haitian immigrants, that it really did change that dynamic. We have another question here that says, has former Polish president, I'm going to say this wrong, Lech Walesa, maybe.
Lech Walesa, yeah.
Right. Come forward with a statement regarding retired General Lloyd Austin's appointment as the U.S. Secretary of Defense?
Oh, my.
Not necessarily a Civil War question, but an interesting Polish race relations question nonetheless.
I don't know, with actually the contemporary history, I'm not that good.
Yeah, so, current events are. I'm way better with dead people than living people too. I don't know all the things that go on in current events.
I'm sorry that I'm
Mr. Wilson, what did Lech Walesa say about Lloyd Austin? Did he not like him, or there was like a controversy around that?
No, what I was asking, the reason I asked that question, it sort of centers around your question about the rate, how the Polish see Black people. And since Lech Walesa was a former, top statesman from Poland, it kind of encapsulates the thought processes of the people of Poland toward Blacks.
I would not,
as a leader, has made a statement for or against, or just whatever he has to say, because that would be in light of your presentation that seemingly, the Polish are, sort of admiring how Black soldiers are, but I don't know. That's the reason I asked the question.
Me personally, I admire that, that they were willing to fight for the government who actually at that time still did not promise them freedom, okay, or guaranteed freedom. The same way, because I was, presenting also, when I was in Valdosta, there was a presentation about African American participation in World War I, which is basically the same thing. Okay, you have like Plessy versus Ferguson, introduction of segregation in the South, and you still have Black volunteers who are willing to fight for such government, which is wow. Okay, this is really something that we should admire. Okay, that country is in danger, so they are fighting no matter what. Later on, we'll think, okay, and we'll try to get something from it. And the same story seems to be during the Civil War. Yes, obviously, they had really big expectations, okay? They thought that by participating in the war, but by showing that they are worthy of freedom, that they will receive it. And yes, they receive freedom, but unfortunately, because of President Johnson, nothing else. Okay, because all in the last phase of the war, they were receiving land. Okay, Johnson then decided that the entire land should be given back to former owners. So blacks remain almost landless in the South. What's more, as already Dr. Aiello said, okay, most of northern states introduced those amendments to their state constitutions that were forbidding blacks from settling in. So they were confined to the South, okay, with their former masters, okay, without land, and in many states, they introduced black codes, which were basically slave codes that were forcing African Americans to have a job by the end of the year. If not, you were going to prison. So the situation of African Americans was really, desperate after the Civil War.
And another thought that comes to mind is that Lech Walesa, when I was a kid growing up and I used to hear about him in the news and how he was leading the fight against injustice. I guess it was at that time economic injustice for the workers of Poland. And I didn't, I think in my mind, I think that he would see General Austin as a black man, as someone to be admired, because General Austin had to go through lots of adversity and lots of setbacks, just as Walesa did during the time of Poland as they were trying to move forward as a country. So, I was just kind of wondering on that. But that, yeah, that was my thought on that.
I wonder, since there are these black volunteers for the Confederacy, was there ever an instance of black soldiers having to fight against one another in the Civil War?
No, because the idea of arming blacks in the Confederate Army, this is fairly idea. This is Patrick Cleburne, and they ultimately voted for in favor of it, but before they could actually create such unit, then the war was ended. So.
Right. Here's the next question. I was under the impression that blacks owned slaves because the freed blacks bought back their relatives. Is this not the case?
No, I don't think so, because the biggest black planter in the South owned more than 100 slaves. So I don't think that was such a big family. Okay, yeah. And no. So maybe in some instances that was happening that way, but I don't think that was a rule. And there's another, I would say, part of that puzzle. Okay, remember about Native Americans who owned slaves, and there's a huge tension between Native Americans and African Americans, especially during the Civil War. The black units and Native American units. Oh my, what that was drastic when they clashed together.
It's true.
That was my question. So, what was the percentage of blacks that owned their own slaves? Was it a high percentage? And where was this allowed?
Obviously it was allowed only in those states that were allowing free blacks to live in. Okay, so we are seeing in Louisiana, I believe in Mississippi as well, and South Carolina, and that's it. I don't know if
there's some in Virginia as well.
Yeah. In Virginia?
In Virginia.
But I believe that after Nat Turner rebellion, they actually changed the law, and there was the free blacks were not allowed to live in Virginia.
No, there was still a free black presence, and there was always a free black presence in Virginia. I mean, they had a free black presence ever since the 1600s, so they weren't going to entirely eliminate them. But you're right. I mean, the two clusters of free black residents who owned slaves were in New Orleans, around New Orleans, and in Virginia, the two places where there's a wealthy free black population. But the percentage of people who did that is minuscule. It is a relatively rare thing.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
It's a very rare thing. And actually, you know, the best book I've ever read on black slave ownership is actually not a history book. It's actually a novel. It's called The Known World. It won the Pulitzer Prize a few years ago. And it's about black slave ownership in Virginia, about a plantation owned by a black family there. And it is super interesting, but it is a minority of the population. It's a vast minority of the population. Even among the free black population, it is a minority. Most free black residents spend most of their time fighting for slaves, not trying to enslave them. So let me ask you this question. Did you find that there was a high count of African-American Civil War troops who committed desertion?
You know, from what I already checked, no. Actually, black soldiers were rather not deserting. Okay, because you know, many of them, you know, they wanted to prove that they are actually good soldiers. Okay, obviously there were some deserters for sure, but there are other, I would say, you know, military crimes that they've committed. So you know, many of them were tried for mutiny. But this is on many occasions actually connected with the pay crisis, that they were actually protesting against lower pay. And unfortunately, that was treated by some white officers as mutiny. But you know, in terms of discipline, these units were really quite well prepared. And I have to admit that from what I was checking, the preparation of officers, even though they were white, okay, but they were much better prepared to command than in volunteer units in the first phase of the war. Okay, so those examinations for officers in US colored troops were really harsh. Okay, it is estimated that close to 50% were able to pass the examination. An additional, you know, 50% was receiving the commission of an officer. So from all applicants, only about 25%, okay, were receiving commissions. And these people were, in most cases, well prepared. So, you know, as there is this ancient law in the army that the only thing that soldiers deserves is a good commander. This is a thing in US colored troops in most cases, okay.
That makes sense. I think that sounds right. I mean, if your whole goal is to try to get freedom, then you don't want to desert because you want to prove that you deserve your freedom when all this is over. That makes sense.
But there are some, you know, scary stories. You know, I don't remember the name of that soldier, but I was checking his files, and you know, he escaped. He was a runaway slave, okay, and he ran away with his entire family. And at the beginning, the policy of the Union Army was that the family can stay with the army, okay, in the army camp. But later on, the commander changed, the policies have changed, and the family was actually forced to leave the camp without any kind of sources to live. And the soldier was just, you know, leaving the camp to provide them with some food and so on. But and he was caught as a deserter, and he actually was executed, which is, come on.
Right. We have another comment here that I think is totally correct. Black and Polish people have had a very contentious history in the U.S. because one had to fight for their own struggles does not translate to understanding or accepting others who had similar struggles. And that certainly makes sense in the light of what you said about the Polish officers in the Black regiments. I think that very much makes sense.
That's true.
These are all great questions. Does anyone have any other questions for us? Excellent. Well, I have to say that this was super interesting. I learned a lot, and I hope you all did too. Thank you so much, Dr. Derengowski, for staying up late to talk to us tonight. It is, many of you might not know, but it is 12:53 in the morning in Poland right now. So we have a special treat having Dr. Derengowski here all the way from far.
My thanks to Mr. Pittman, for my former student from VSU, for inviting me to the series.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Doctor, let me say this. I want to thank you, Doctor, also for traveling this far to be with us tonight. And I hope you'll be able to have a good flight going back. We just appreciate you, and thank Daniels for pulling this off again, and thank the audience that are here. Thank you, Dr. Empanella, right? I get it wrong, but appreciate you narrating this for us, emceeing it for us. And again, thank everyone that came on board.